Hi guys, welcome once again to Premium PCs. Just a couple of weeks ago, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order launched on the PC and consoles, and it's a pretty amazing game. In fact, it inspired me to try out a cheat that I thought of.
What are you doing?
I've got the high ground!
What are you doing in my house?
The most interesting thing for me about the game was actually the recommended hardware specs, as they are very demanding. The game recommends a Ryzen 7 1700 or i7 6700K with 16GB of RAM and a GTX 1070 or Vega 56. Just a couple of years ago, this would pretty much have been a top flight PC, whether you're on the Intel or AMD platforms. There wasn't all that much higher you could go on a consumer desktop. The minimum specs are not quite as demanding, but they are still pretty tough, with an i3 3220 or FX 6100, 8GB of RAM, and a GTX 650 or HD 7750. So what we're going to have a look at today is what does it mean if you have got the recommended hardware for the game? What does it mean if you've got the minimum hardware for the game? And we're going to see what that turns out into playability, frames per second, and we're going to run a few benchmarks to find all of that out. The hardware that we're going to be using for the tests are 8GB of memory, an i3 3220, and coming in just above the minimum recommended spec, a GTX 650 Ti. We've also got, for the recommended spec, 16GB of RAM, just slightly above with a Ryzen 7 1700X, and a GeForce 1070 Ti. I've also got what is, according to the Steam survey, much closer to the average spec that most of you guys are going to have, with a quad-core i5 and a GTX 1050 Ti. Now, 1060 would have been better for this test, as it's just a couple of percentiles more popular than 1050 Ti, but we're going to get a good idea of the picture of what we can expect. So, let's have a look at the benchmark run, and let's have a look at some results. Since this game doesn't include a benchmark feature, I used the first 4 minutes of the game for these tests, as it has a good combination of cutscenes and gameplay. Even with the recommended hardware, the intro still had some drops below 60 FPS. Can someone get this walking carpet out of my way? I used my personal rig for an idea of the recommended hardware, which means the results should be around 10% better than the actual recommendations, with a 1700X rather than a 1700 and a 1070 Ti over the 1070. For the overclock test, I pushed the 1700X to 4 GHz on all cores and got an extra 200 MHz on the core of the 1070 Ti with a 115 MHz boost to the memory clock as well. For the minimum spec, I used my test bench with the i3 3220 and a GTX 650 Ti. This spec started showing its age even before I started the testing. It just felt very sluggish. In-game, as expected, the FPS was unplayable at max settings and a lot of textures were completely failing to render. The game only became playable at 720p medium. For the overclock test, the i3 was obviously locked, so all the work was done by the 650 Ti, which achieved a small boost of just over 100 MHz on core and memory.
And finally, for the average gaming spec, I upgraded the test bench with an i5-3470 and the GTX 1050 Ti. This proved to be playable across the board for the most part, but the FPS was pretty low at the high end of the settings. However, unlike the 650, the 1050's 4GB of RAM made sure all the textures were getting rendered. For the overclock test, the CPU was once again locked, so the 1050 Ti was pushed to an extra 205 MHz on the core and 115 MHz on the memory clock. So let's have a look at the charts. Oops, don't know how that one got in there. At 1440p, the minimum spec was sorely outclassed, never reaching a playable FPS. The recommended spec stayed consistently above 60 frames per second average, and the middle set got passable frames at medium settings. At 1440p overclocked, the 650's frames per second barely changed. The middle set achieves playable frames at the high preset, and obviously the recommended set just got further in front. At 1080p, which is the most popular resolution according to the Steam survey, our minimum spec system still fell short of playable frames. The recommended set didn't show much improvement, but the average set nearly doubled its frames per second, getting close to the 60 frames per second sweet spot. It's much the same story with the overclock test, the recommended set showing the most improvement and next to no change at the minimum end. And at 720p, the recommended set gave up trying as the resolution wasn't challenging enough for the 1070 Ti, but the 650 and 1050 really gained some ground, giving our minimum spec its first full set of passable FPS, and overclocking once again making the most significant difference at the top, with minimal changes at the low end.
So from the results, what we can determine is that if you have got the recommended set of hardware, you're going to get the full experience that the developers wanted to give you from the game. You can run it at the maximum settings in the most popular resolutions and get above 60 frames per second, which is exactly what you want. However, if you're down towards the bottom end here, you're not really getting that. You're having to dial everything back to try and keep the frame rates playable. This particular game still does look pretty good on minimum settings, but you're not getting the intended experience out of the game. And to some extent that also goes for the middle set of hardware. While you can get above 30 frames per second playing at the maximum settings, in more intensive parts of the game it is going to drop below that, so once again you have to dial back and you're not really getting the maximum that the developers intended from the game. But the scary part of this is the fact that this is now the recommended spec, which probably means it's going to be time to upgrade very soon, because give it another year or so, it's not going to be a 1070 they're recommending, it's going to be a 1080 or an RTX 2070. We have now reached the point where just a few years ago, top of the line hardware is recommended specs for a game. Realistically, to stay ahead of the curve, you need to be above and beyond that. If you're at this bottom end, you might have another 6 months left of playing AAA games at best. It's probably time to look for at least a graphics card upgrade. If you're running an i3 3220, you can probably pick up an i5 or an i7 for less than £100 to upgrade your system. That's going to go miles for improving your gaming experience. And if you've got the 650 Ti, get yourself a 1050 or a 1650. It's going to do a hell of a lot better of a job for AAA gaming than this. It's going to last you another couple of years at those medium specs. The other thing that we can take away from the results is that overclocking is going to give you a decent improvement to your game's performance, but on a sort of sliding scale. You see, at the top end of the results, the overclocking made the most significant difference. We got up to 13% improvement in frames per second by overclocking with this set of hardware. But once again, at the bottom end, that difference was very minimal, and the processor obviously wasn't overclockable, just the graphics card in this situation. We weren't really able to push the clocks all that far, with it being older hardware, not particularly well cooled, with it being It looks like a beefy cooler on here, but it's actually very thin inside there. It's more plastic shroud than it is cooler. So we can't really get all that much squeezed out of the 650 Ti. Sure, we see an improvement, but it's barely worth the extra noise you get from the fan running. And in the middle range, yeah, we do get some improvements, but once again, it's hard to see how much it's worth it. So yeah, I mean, I always overclock my stuff, but actually, maybe I'm not really getting all that much extra out of it. I'm lucky enough that this is the set of hardware that I'm using daily if I'm going to be playing games. But the average set of hardware, should you overclock it? Is it worth the extra noise for those extra couple of frames per second? Maybe in some titles it is. With this one, I don't really think it's worth the benefit. And for the bottom set of hardware, once again, come on guys, if you're still using this, get an upgrade. Don't overclock it. It's just not worth it. Get yourself something new. Well, that wraps it up for another video, guys. Thanks for watching. I hope it was somewhat informative for you. If you like the video, make sure to hit the like button, and if you're new to the channel, subscribe for more videos coming soon. So until next time, see you later.